Okay, you'll see I've sent the handout, which, as always, is available on the website as well. I've also sent an article that, just as chance would have it, came out in this past week, which is a survey article about naturalism. It's written for a somewhat more general audience, and I think it's instructive to read this. I urge you to have a look at it. From the point of view of the crucial distinction that we talked about last week between object naturalism and subject naturalism, it would more accurately be entitled object naturalisms. But I think it's instructive because the author clearly is innocent of the distinction. It's not occurred to her that there might be some other version of naturalism. And if you read through it at various points, you'll see the implicit representationalist assumption that Price claims is responsible for people assuming that naturalism means object naturalism. You'll see it nearly bubbling to the surface at various places. And at some of the places, I think one wants to sort of jump in and say, no, but you're overlooking an alternative here. And I think this is a good experience to have. It's the idea that the discussion is bent out of shape by an assumption that's invisible to the author, and that as a result, they're overlooking important possibilities, important occupants of the space of alternatives. This is what absolutely the entire world looks like to John McDowell. There is nothing he can read that does not have this shape for him. The implicit assumptions, bending the discussion out of shape, making invisible important alternatives. So it's useful to read this just so once, at least, you can see what the world looks like through John's eyes. But I also think as an expository exercise, if you think, well, how would I set this straight? If I were, for instance, commenting on this paper at a meeting, what would my entry point be? How would I raise this possibility and discuss it? And if you're at all moved to write yourself about the subject naturalism, object naturalism distinction, this might give you a place. This might give you a place to start. So that's why I've passed it on. Now, as I mentioned last time, the focus really was on this distinction between subject naturalism and object naturalism. This week, I want to move into other important ideas that Huw Price in particular has had, and begin to open up the discussion to show how Simon Blackburn comes into it. And I thought one thing that might be useful is to provide a little bit of sociological background. So if you'll think back to our discussion of Cheryl Mesack, I suggested that she had really two fundamental contributions to make, two big ideas that had transformed our understanding of the pragmatist tradition. And one was a redescription and really a recentering of the classical American pragmatism by emphasizing the Peirce, Lewis, Sellers strand, as opposed to the James Dewey, Rorty strand of it, to remind us that there are these two wings, one of which tended to be de-emphasized in readings of this tradition. And the second was her, again, I hope it's for students of pragmatism in some sense a reminder, but again, she emphasized that pragmatism has not been an exclusively American phenomenon, that we need to think about Cambridge pragmatism as well, whose avatars are Frank Ramsey and Wittgenstein. And what we're seeing as we go forward in the course from this point is that tradition of Cambridge pragmatism, I say Cambridge Platonism, she is using the phrase Cambridge pragmatism, looking over her shoulder at the Cambridge Platonism of the immortal Ralph Cudworth, for instance, from some centuries ago. But Cambridge pragmatism is alive and well in the first two occupants of the relatively new Bertrand Russell Professorship of Philosophy at Trinity College, Cambridge, namely Simon Blackburn, who was the inaugural holder of it, and then his Nachfolger is Huw Price. Trinity, of course, is where Bertrand Russell was. It's where Wittgenstein was. So it has an honorable history in philosophy. And when Simon Blackburn took up the professorship, they asked him where he wanted to have his office. And he said, really, he'd like to have whatever office Wittgenstein had occupied. That was the one that was resonant for him. And now, if I can use the technology here, let me, yes, so this is the main quad at Trinity. Can you see that? Yes, okay. Here's the library quad. You can see this is all rather grand. This is where Bertrand Russell held court. Wittgenstein would have none of this. He was horrified by the grandeur of it. Growing up in Vienna as he did, he got used to this very early on. So the only place he would let them put him was in an annex across the street, in a fifth floor walk-up office looking away from the Grand Trinity Cambridge. This is a picture I took from Wittgenstein's window because it's it was at that point Simon Blackburn's office. This is what oh, did I get that up there? Sorry. I did that. Oh, wrong. Here you are. Can you see that now? This is the view out Wittgenstein's window, and it's still Simon Blackburn's window, rather different than the different quads within Trinity College there. Although she would be the last one to say this, besides Simon Blackburn and Huw Price, in the current generation of Cambridge pragmatists, we should mention Misak herself, whose doctorate is from Cambridge. And she was supported in her work, particularly on her book on Cambridge Pragmatism and her book on Frank Ramsey, by Blackburn and Price. So it's not merely a sort of notional affiliation here. There really is a group. So let me remind you quickly that of the distinction we talked about last time, because this, as I say, this is what I hope everybody takes away from last week. The distinction between object naturalism, naturalism about the objects that you're talking about, describing or representing in some vocabulary, some potentially puzzling or problematic vocabulary. Blackburn talks about the 3 M's, modals, morals, and mathematics. But we've seen that, for instance, semantic vocabulary of talk about truth is equally a candidate. And Price's innovation is contrasting that with another naturalist strategy, subject naturalism, naturalism about the practices one engages in using the expressions that the object naturalist understands on a representational semantic model. And Price asserts a priority thesis that in the order of explanation, subject naturalism has to come first. You want to understand this vocabulary, and that you get to the idea of understanding it in the object naturalist way only if you take it that the vocabulary that is your target, the target of your naturalism, has as its principal expressive role representing or describing how things are. And if that's so, if that's an essential element of it, then your naturalism ought to extend to the objects that you're talking and thinking about. But that's not the expressive role characteristic of all vocabularies. And for them, it may be sufficient to be a naturalist about the practices of using that vocabulary to talk and think without extending to what you're talking or thinking about. And I suggested that I actually think there's a more general point one can make here, that it's at least in principle possible to divide through by the naturalism in this important distinction of Price's. And I want to say something about what I mean by that, and also how it's possible, in a sense, to divide through by the representationalism in understanding this distinction. So I want to generalize it along a couple of dimensions. So I guess the way I would begin is by saying we should focus on naturalism as a meta vocabulary. The idea is it's a vocabulary for discussing vocabularies. Subject naturalism says that there's some target vocabulary, say normative vocabulary. And the subject naturalist is going to use naturalistic vocabulary, the vocabulary of some natural science, to address, to characterize that potentially problematic target vocabulary. In the case of object naturalism, the thought is to use a naturalistic meta-vocabulary to characterize the representeds rather than the activity of representing. Rorty, remember, referred to that old pragmatist chestnut that you have to use some vocabulary to specify what it is you're talking about, even if you're a representationalist. And the object naturalist is committed to your being able to do that using a naturalistic meta-vocabulary to specify what's represented, as opposed to the subject naturalist using a naturalistic meta-vocabulary to specify the activity of representing, what you're doing in using the vocabulary which the object naturalist understands as representing or describing something. Well, the first observation, I think, is that we can think of the distinction between the use of a naturalistic meta-vocabulary on the part of the object naturalist and on the part of the subject naturalist as a distinction between a semantic meta-vocabulary and a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. If we think about semantics as the study of content and pragmatics as the study of use, then the subject naturalist is saying, let's use a naturalistic meta-vocabulary as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, the vocabulary we use to describe what you do when you apply the expressions of the target vocabulary. And the object naturalist is saying, no, we want to use it as a semantic meta-vocabulary. I, the object naturalist, am a representationalist in my semantics. So if I'm David Armstrong, I want to know about a vocabulary, what makes its claims true, or what determines whether they're true or false? What are the truth makers of this kind of vocabulary? And if I'm Frank Jackson, I want to know what are the objects, properties, and relations that I'm talking about, that I'm representing the world as containing when I use this vocabulary. So the object naturalist is interested in a semantic meta-vocabulary that will let us specify the semantic interpretants of the problematic target vocabulary. Whereas the subject naturalist is interested in using the naturalistic vocabulary as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, a vocabulary to describe what you're doing in deploying the problematic target vocabulary, using that vocabulary so as to express the kind of contents that would then be of semantic interest. But now, it's at least not obvious that you ought to use the same vocabulary as a semantic meta-vocabulary and as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. Maybe the way you talk about talking should be different from the way you talk about what you're talking or thinking about. So for instance, you might think that a normative vocabulary is appropriate as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, that in order to say what you have to be doing in order to be applying a certain vocabulary, you have to talk about how it's proper or correct to use it, not just how somebody is disposed to use it. And you might or might not think that that meta-vocabulary, normative vocabulary, which is appropriate to use, let's say, as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, is the right one to use to talk about what you're talking about, even if you are a representationalist in your semantics, and so think that you need a semantic meta-vocabulary. It's, for instance, entirely intelligible that you should be a naturalist in your choice of semantic metavocabularies and a normativist in your choice of pragmatic metavocabularies. Now, at the same time that Huw was first making this subject naturalism, object naturalism distinction, 2006, 2007, he was writing the things that we read last week. I was giving my Locke lectures, which are devoted to the question of how we should think about the relation between pragmatic metavocabularies and semantic metavocabularies, not assuming that they needed to coincide, taking into account that you might want to use different vocabularies to specify the contents that are expressed by using a vocabulary on the one hand, and the practices of using it, or the abilities that you have to count as deploying the vocabulary on the other hand. Indeed, the constructive task of those Locke lectures, published as Between Saying and Doing, was to specify a meta-meta vocabulary for thinking about the relation between semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies. I gave those Locke lectures 3 times, first in Oxford, second time in Prague, and a third time in Buenos Aires. For the Prague telling of them, of those stories, there were commentators, John McDowell, John McFarlane, Sebastian Rödel, and Huw Price was one of the commentators. That series of lectures was videotaped, including the commentary and question period. You can find that on YouTube. There's links to it on the videos page of my website. If you want to look at the one that Huw is a commentator, it's the fourth lecture. But he and I saw that we were pushing in the same direction. He with the distinction between subject and object naturalism, and I with what I fondly think of as a generalization of that. And indeed, in the run-up, when I was working on the lectures in 2005, Huw put on one of his Sydney conferences on expressivism. And as we were having lunch one time in the middle of that conference, I drew on a napkin some of the diagrams, the meaning use diagrams that expressed this, that were the form of this meta vocabulary for thinking about the relation between semantic and pragmatic meta vocabularies. And though I didn't realize it, he put that napkin in his pocket, and at a meeting years later, pulled out a slide of this hastily scrawled meaning use diagram in order to compare and contrast his view with mine. But I said I wanted to think about this crucial distinction between subject and object naturalism first by dividing through by the naturalism. And I suggested how to do that. That is, if you think about what's at issue as being, on the one hand, a semantic metavocabulary, on the other hand, a pragmatic metavocabulary, then the way is open to using as such meta vocabulary something other than naturalistic vocabulary. And in particular, the way is open to using something different for your semantic meta vocabulary than you do for your pragmatic meta vocabulary. That's what I mean by dividing through by the naturalism. The important distinction is the distinction between a semantic meta vocabulary and a pragmatic meta vocabulary. That's what's going to do the real work. For instance, in understanding the distinction between what Wittgenstein is doing in the Tractatus and what he's doing in the investigations. The Tractatus is a matter of articulating a representational semantic meta vocabulary. The topic of the investigations is to understand the social practices of using vocabulary, that is, to articulate a social, I would say implicitly normative, pragmatic meta vocabulary. So the distinction that I see as key doesn't turn on naturalistic commitments. That's an additional commitment that you can have, which you can then say, look, your naturalism could be articulated in the form of a naturalistic semantic meta vocabulary, or in the form of a naturalistic pragmatic meta vocabulary. But the important thing is to distinguish those two. Let me stop there. Is that move I'm making clear enough? Anybody want to say something about that?
Just as a clarification, so would Rorty's response to this be that there isn't a distinction?
I think, Rorty was a big fan of Price's distinction, and his thought was, what we should be doing is just studying the practice of using vocabularies. We shouldn't we shouldn't worry about semantic meta vocabularies at all, in my terms. Let's just do the pragmatics. And this is a kind of pragmatism to say, don't worry about the meaning, the pragmatics, worry about the use. Don't worry about the meaning, the semantics, worry about the pragmatics, worry about the use. That's, I put it that way to pick up the Wittgensteinian flavor of it. But just as Huw is recommending we be subject naturalists, not representationalists, and so not object naturalists, Rorty would say, in my terms, worry about the pragmatics, not about the semantics. Now, we'll see. My own view is that you don't need to pick between doing the semantics and the pragmatics, that there's a kind of methodological pragmatism that says, in line with Price's priority thesis, you've got to understand the semantic task, content, in terms of the pragmatics, in terms of use. But it's entirely possible to keep the two sets of books.
I see. So yeah, I guess like my question is coming from your discussion of Armstrong using the semantic meta vocabulary. So the view that Rorty has is that no, you shouldn't, you should use the pragmatic, but it's not saying that the semantic is pragmatic. That would be making a different move, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
we'll see Price distinguishing these as well, and his urging that, for instance, semantic minimalists keep to their negative deflationary thesis and don't endorse the positive bifurcationist thesis, which in effect says, for our discourse, for the one that we care about, all there is the pragmatics, unlike that genuinely descriptive representational discourse, which also has a semantics.
Thank you.
I mean, it's a short step at this point to see what I meant by the slogan, not only can we divide through by the naturalism in this distinction between subject and object naturalism, we can divide through by the representationalism. That is, it's not essential that the semantic meta vocabulary be a representationalist vocabulary. If you have some other notion of content, if, for instance, you think of content in terms of inferential roles, there's still the question, well, what's a good semantic meta vocabulary, and what's a good pragmatic meta vocabulary, and what's the relation between those? That's a question that can come up even if you're not a representationalist. And Rorty's position that you just shouldn't do semantics, that was a mistake, maybe motivated by the representational paradigm, by thinking of the mind and then later on language as mirrors of nature, thinking that's what they were. And Rorty says, if instead of thinking of them, of thinking of the language as having as its overarching function copying, we think copying the world, we think of it as coping with the world. Price quotes, you'll see on the passages in the handout, this coping, not copying slogan of Rorty's. Well, then, if the only kind of semantics you had was representational semantics, don't do the semantics at all. That was just a bad idea. That was a consequence of the representationalist model. But if the important distinction is the distinction between meaning and use, and the vocabulary you use to specify meaning, semantic meta vocabulary on the one hand, and the vocabulary you use to specify use, the pragmatic meta vocabulary on the other hand, then representationalism is another optional commitment. I mean, in Price's case, the optional commitment to naturalism is one he wants to make. In both cases, well, anyway, in the enterprise he wants to endorse, the subject naturalism, he still, yes, he wants a naturalistic, pragmatic meta vocabulary, and he's going to think of the semantics in representational terms. So his rejection of having a semantic meta vocabulary at all is a rejection of representationalism. But we might have a broader semantic model and still think that the distinction between semantic and pragmatic meta vocabularies was important. So we can divide through by both those commitments, is what I want to say. And this way of thinking about things, that is the broader, more general way that I'm recommending, is evidently downstream from Rorty's introduction of the vocabulary. It's indicating, well, that there are really these two kinds of vocabularies for talking about vocabularies that we can have corresponding to the semantics and the pragmatics.
Bob, is it true though? It seems like Price is so effective because he's making this incendiary accusation against his interlocutor that they're not being a good naturalist. So he seems to presume, and I think correctly, that most of his broader interlocutors are already committed to naturalism. And he's suggesting, well, maybe you haven't thought hard enough about the kind of seemingly non-naturalistic or bogus semantic presuppositions of your model. So if that's fair of sort of his position, then maybe he just, he sees that as being the more effective wedge to drive in broader philosophy, right?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you. Rhetorically, his approach is much more effective, and I don't use rhetorical in a pejorative sense, as though this were a matter of sort of dazzling you with verbal effects or something like that. I mean, as a persuasive strategy, though of the two great programs of classical analytic philosophy, empiricism and naturalism, empiricism is quite out of favor in the wake of Sellers and Quine's critiques of the sort Rorty rehearsed in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. It's hard to find non-naturalists of any stripe today. And so moving in from naturalism is a really effective way into this topic. But I want to be saying, let's not unduly limit our budget of options because of that. Now, this is going to remain a difference between Price and me, in that I think that if your pragmatic metavocabulary isn't a normative, doesn't essentially use normative vocabulary, that you're not going to be able to understand how you can confer meanings on things, because I take it meaning is an implicitly normative concept. And indeed, one of the principal innovations of making it explicit was to say, well, first of all, your description of use should be normative. You want a normative pragmatics. And this was not so innovative. I certainly think Wittgenstein thought that, Dewey thought that. Any of the assertability theorists, Dewey, Sellers, Dummett, are saying, think about the practice of using expressions in terms of when it's appropriate or inappropriate to use it, when it's correct or incorrect, when is a declarative sentence assertable and when is it not. Those are single sorted normative metavocabularies. You've got one normative status, assertable, well, and it can apply or not. Assertable, correct, appropriate, or not. It's an on-off thing. And I suggest that it's at least, you at least get a huge increase in the expressive power of your pragmatic metavocabulary if it's a two-sorted normative metavocabulary. In making it explicit, the two normative statuses are commitment and entitlement, and the argument, we saw this from the 5th chapter of Articulating Reasons, is that a game of, to be recognizable as a game or practice of giving and asking for reasons, you need to distinguish these. When you make a claim, you've committed yourself, there's an on-off distinction of whether you're committed or not, but for reasons to be involved, there has to be a difference between commitments that you're entitled to and those that you're not. And you get really a bonanza of expressive power if you use a two-sorted pragmatic metavocabulary. And I'll just mention that at the core of my reading of Hegel in A Spirit of Trust is seeing his notions of independence and dependence as two, on the side of subjects, as also a two-sorted normative, pragmatic meta-vocabulary. Independence for him is authority, and dependence is responsibility. And he uses the greater expressive power of that two-sorted normative, pragmatic meta-vocabulary in quite different ways than I do in making it explicit, but again, exploiting the greater expressive power of the two-sorted scheme. A naturalistic, pragmatic meta-vocabulary is committed not only to working with dispositions, that is, with a lethic modal meta-vocabulary, but also to foregoing the use of specifically normative vocabulary in specifying what you're disposed to do. You can't, it's against the rules of a naturalistic pragmatic meta-vocabulary to invoke dispositions to use an expression correctly or incorrectly, for instance. So it's not only integral to what what Huw is doing that it be done within a naturalistic framework, but as you say, he connects to an audience immediately by making the more specific version of the distinction that I'm talking about. Okay. So there's three essays of Price that we looked at for this week. I know this is a lot to get through. That's why I'm sort of boiling these things down for you with the passages which sequentially move through. These are basically in chronological order. You can see him layering on new points. And so I want to talk relatively briefly about sort of what's new in each of these essays. So the first, where we're going with this is that Price pulls off a really remarkable intellectual feat in synthesizing the pragmatist tradition that he's inheriting from Rorty and from Wittgenstein, understanding Wittgenstein as, in a broad sense, a subject naturalist, and seeing that as contiguous with Rorty's pragmatism, synthesizing that tradition with the tradition he calls Humean expressivism, whose paradigm is metaethical expressivism. And it was by no means obvious to, for instance, the Humean expressivists, the paradigm expressivists who he's invoking, Simon Blackburn and Alan Gibbard, maybe can stand in for all of them. They, at any rate, did not see great affinities spontaneously between what they were doing and this pragmatist tradition. And Price convincingly synthesized them. And one of the things I think we'll find interesting as we start to read Blackburn next week and in the following weeks is the trajectory he takes as he's gradually coming to think in the pragmatist terms, to use the pragmatist vocabulary that Price is offering him. And what's distinctive of the current generation of Cambridge pragmatists is the result of this synthesis. So that's the big thing that he accomplishes, and we want to look at some of the steps that he takes to do that. So in One Chair for Representationalism, remember, well, I should say there's another trajectory here. One Chair for Representationalism has Price softening his hardline anti-representationalism and saying, well, there's, and this has 3 levels of invocation of representation, and the first one's okay. I won't set my face against that. And if we look at the handout, well, the very last statement on the handout, page 9, from the third essay, this is at the end of this trajectory. He says, until recently, I had thought of myself as a straight up and down anti-representationalist in the tradition of Dewey, Wittgenstein, and Rorty. That's where he began. But now, even if I'm still opposed to big R representationalism, I find that far from being an eliminativist about representation, so he's using the Rortyian phrase, Rorty's an eliminative materialist about the Cartesian mind, far from being an eliminativist about representation, I'm heading in the other direction. I'm a dualist, not a nihilist. That is, he ends up with 2 notions of representation, each of which he thinks is okay in its place. What we mustn't do is run them together. In One Cheer, he says he ends up positioning himself between Rorty and my position and making it explicit, taking one step towards a use of representation that's hygienic from a pragmatist point of view. So we want to see this trajectory as he gets a more and more nuanced view of the different roles representation can play in philosophical theorizing, makes more distinctions, and so moves away from the sort of sweeping condemnation of any appeal to representational notions that Rorty was fond of making. Price comes to make more distinctions and finds that some of them are acceptable to him. So in that last, at the top of page 4 on the handout, the last passage from One Chair for Representationalism, in according this kind of centrality to assertion, I'm one step closer to the orthodoxy than the view, arguably Wittgenstein's and perhaps Rorty's, that even this much representationalism is too much. Hence my One Chair for Representationalism. But I'm one step further from the orthodoxy than the view that Brandom appears at least tempted to adopt, which aims to build a substantial notion of representational content from expressivist and pragmatist raw materials. And that expressivist and pragmatist he's still speaking with the vulgar there. He's already himself seeing those as just two ways of talking about one thing, but isn't presuming that he's done that job yet. So the way I would describe what goes on in this first essay, the one cheer for representationalism, is he's developing the thoughts about semantic minimalism that we saw in the essay in which he introduced the subject naturalism, object naturalism distinction. And remember there he had argued that at least some representationalists thought of semantic minimalism, that is, disquotational theories or prosentential theories of truth, as arguing for object naturalism. He wanted to say, no, if you properly understand them, they argue against them. I suggested last time that we could usefully think of the arguments that he was addressing there as proceeding in two steps, declarativism and then descriptivism, where declarativism says we should treat all declarative sentences as fundamentally doing the same thing. They're all used to make assertions, and they're all going to be truth evaluable. I'll say a little bit more about the declarativism in just a minute. That suggests that they should all be given the same semantic treatment. And descriptivism then says, well, yes, and that common expressive function that all assertables, claimables expressed by declarative sentences have is to describe the world or to represent how things are. And here Huw argues, in effect, he doesn't put things this way, that though semantic minimalism might tempt you to descriptivism, all it really endorses is declarativism, and it gives you no reason to pass on from declarativism to descriptivism. So the idea that semantic minimalism, properly understood, breaks the connection between declarativism and descriptivism, and he's going to say that the kind of representationalism he can applaud is the kind that goes no farther than declarativism, which gives us truth evaluability, but in a deflationary way. So to fill in the notion of that's behind declarativism, Price introduces this using a trope of Wittgenstein's that I had picked up. Wittgenstein famously says, language doesn't have a downtown. He thinks of it as a city that's all suburbs, where each neighborhood grew out into the other neighborhoods without there being some core to it. This is an alternative metaphor to the tool metaphor. But the idea is there isn't some one functional role that language performs, for instance, description or representation. There are all kinds of things you can do with language, and his image of a city that's all suburbs, maybe Los Angeles, is his picture rather than New York or London. And I've argued that that's not right, that language does have a downtown, and its assertion that what makes something a discursive practice is that some performances in that practice can have the significance of claiming that things are thus and so, of asserting. Assertions are the positions in games where the moves are inferences. The inferences are treating one claim as a reason for or against another. So the claim is that practices of giving and challenging reasons, making claims and giving and asking for reasons for claims, those are two sides of one coin, that's downtown in discursive practice. That any practice that doesn't have assertions in it should not be thought of as a discursive practice. It can be a vocal practice, but not a verbal one. And many of Wittgenstein's toy Sprachspiel, language games, I say aren't really language games. The slab game that he opens the investigations with, that have the builder who will make noises. Wittgenstein calls them calls. Ruf is the term that he uses. We'll say slab. And the appropriate thing for his helper to do is to bring him a slab. Or he'll say pillar. And the appropriate way for the assistant to respond is to bring him the pillar. Each call has an appropriate response to it. And that's all there is to the game. That's a paradigm for me of one that is vocal and not verbal. What makes something a discursive practice is the iron triangle of a pragmatics, a semantics, and a syntax. On the side of pragmatics, that some performances have the pragmatic significance of making claims, of being assertions, of being discursive commitments. And part of them being discursive commitments is that it's appropriate to ask for reasons justifying or entitling them, and that giving reasons is going to be making more claims. The performances that have that significance are utterances of declarative sentences. On the side of syntax, we're going to understand declarative sentences in terms of the pragmatic significance of their utterance, and the contents that those performances, those utterances of declarative sentences express count as propositional contents in the sense of being claimables, being assertables, which is to say, things that can be given as reasons and for which it's appropriate to demand reasons. That is, things that can play the role of premises and conclusions in inferences. Now, this is the broadest outlines of the making it explicit picture. And the representationalism that Huw gives one cheer for is this picture. He's saying, all right, it seems to be Brandom is right and Wittgenstein is wrong about language having a downtown. It is plausible to identify the asserting, inferring practices as the pragmatic corner of a triangle that has claimables, propositional contents as its semantic corner, and declarative sentences as its syntactic corner. And this is a point of contact with expressivism. Because first wave metaethical expressivism, and this was the home language game of the term expressivism and of this train of thought, said you shouldn't understand normative statements, really moral normative statements as the ones they cared about, saying what's right and wrong or what duties you have, as representing the world as being some way, as describing the world as some way, as being some way. That's not the kind of speech act it is. It's an expression of an attitude, pro or con. So these were thought of as sometimes caricatured as boo hurrah views of normative vocabulary. In saying you ought not do that, I'm expressing my disapproval of it. In saying that that's a good thing, I'm expressing my approval of it, approval and disapproval here. When Geach, in an argument I've talked about before in his gem-like article Ascriptivism, pointed out that in effect, that theory only includes, it only addresses freestanding uses of normative claims. The use of normative claims to make assertions like that's wrong or you ought not to do that. But those claims also occur embedded as components of other sentences. If that's a bad thing to do, I can say, then you have reason not to do it. And now I haven't expressed my disapproval because I haven't endorsed the claim that was the antecedent of the conditional. Well, there's some propositional content there when it's occurring embedded, and it isn't there expressing approval or disapproval. And anything that can be embedded as the antecedent of a conditional, stripping off its pragmatic significance or its Phrygian force, what you're doing in asserting it, you're not asserting it if it's only embedded. The same thing is true when you embed it in, I mean, it's anything that's embeddable that way is also embeddable in a truth context. You'd say, well, it's true that you ought to do that. And that's an invitation now for Armstrong to ask, well, what are the truth makers for it? Well, the dividing line between first wave metaethical expressivists like A.J. Ayer, C.L. Stevenson, and second wave metaethical expressivists like Blackburn and Gibbard is just that the second wave was obliged to take this seriously, that declarativism extends to normative vocabulary. You can express whatever normative vocabulary expresses by uttering declarative sentences, which take truth evaluations, which can be embedded in contexts like the antecedent of a conditional that strip off the force from them. So they need to be they need to be intelligible as having whatever kind of content goes with being expressible by a declarative sentence, not just in its freestanding assertional use, but also in conditionals codifying the reason relations that they stand into other things. And Gibbard and Blackburn take on this constructive philosophical challenge, and each of them, in their own way, tells a story about how, though the primary use of these normative locutions is their freestanding assertional use when they should be understood as expressing some sort of attitude rather than describing things, that in virtue of playing that principal expressive role, we can see them as inheriting a kind of parasitic secondary truth evaluable, embeddable role. So the expressivists that Huw is trying to bring into the pragmatist fold to synthesize with Rortyian pragmatists already accepted declarativism. And he sees the sort of story about assertion and the giving and asking for reasons, propositional contents as what can serve as and stand in need of reasons, that is, what can play the role of premises and conclusions of inferences. He says, all that's good. That much representationalism we ought to take on board, because even the second wave metaethical expressivists had to take that much on board. To do that, we're going to understand, though, the truth evaluability that goes with these declarative sentences, these things that can be asserted and embedded. We're going to have a deflationary view about that, a disquotational, prosentential, whatever version of semantic minimalism you want to have. And Huw just says, stop there at the declarativism and don't go on to a descriptivist semantics to see any more robust notion of representation as involved in the semantics. So that's the position he wants. He wants to use semantic minimalism to articulate declarativism in a deflationary tone and break the connection to descriptivism. That's how far he's gotten, I think, at the end of the one chair essay. Let me stop there. Yeah, Thomas.
I just want to clarify something about how the dialectic, the expressivist dialectic unfolds. So the first wave, declarative normative statements express attitudes. Then you get the embedding problem. And then did you say that, so like the second wave people like Blackburn and Gibbard are obliged to take, so you said they're obliged to take seriously that declarativism extends to normative statements, and that therefore they should have whatever kind of content goes with freestanding declarative sentences, or just normative sentence, freestanding declarative normative sentences?
Well, with all the rest of the declarative sentences. That is, typically, as Huw says, these are local expressivists in the sense they're saying, look, I'm just talking about this vocabulary, ethical, vocabulary or meta-ethical vocabulary, well, ethical vocabulary here, but the embedding argument shows that there's a kind of content that they share with ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And so they needed to acknowledge that. And Huw wants to say that doesn't mean you have to understand that representationally in any robust sense. Mm-hmm. But you do have to say what that kind of content is. And that's the point at which it's attractive to him, and he wants to make it attractive to people like Blackburn and Gibbard to say, well, think about the inferential role. The fact that you can use these sentences in reasoning as premises and conclusions, that's why you can embed them in conditionals. That's why you can attach truth predicates to them, because it makes them disquotational. Here's a non-representational way of thinking about the content that they all share, that we can see. We can't just tell completely disjoint stories about some declarative sentences and not about others, that we do need to put them in one boat. And the representationalist said, well, the only semantic theory floating, the only one available, is a representational theory. So you see, you're conceding that that you're committed either to there being normative facts or to all these claims being false. And he's saying, no, we don't need to say that. We need to say there's the declarativists are right, there's something in common to everything you can express with a declarative sentence. You can use those to make assertions, you can embed them, you can truth evaluate them, but we can be quite deflationary about that. We don't have to then take the additional step of understanding that notion of content in a descriptivist or a representationalist way.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
So, I mean, what he's going to do in the next essay is apply that lesson about semantic vocabulary to everything you could be an expressivist about, not just being an expressivist about true and refers, or being an expressivist about moral vocabulary, but all of Blackburn's 3 M's and whatever else we might take as target vocabularies for some sort of an expressivist or pragmatist account. I think I can say fairly compactly what the project of the Expressivism for 2 voices is. This is where he explicitly tries to bring in, begins his redescription of what he calls Humean expressivism, which is is Blackburn's characterization of his own view, the view that Blackburn also calls quasi-realism. It's realism in that he's going to end up saying there is a kind of propositional content associated with, expressed by the uses of the problematic vocabulary, the 3 M's, 2 of which he actually addresses, the morals and the modals. But Blackburn is a better target for him than Gibbard, though he invited Gibbard to this sequence of Sydney conferences as well, and I think made progress in getting Gibbard also to see affinities that they hadn't seen with the pragmatists. The principal affinity is that he saw, as I would put it, well, he saw that the essence of their local expressivisms, paradigmatically metaethical expressivism, was to say, don't think, at least to begin with, about what you're saying when you offer a moral appraisal, when you say that something is as it ought to be, or that someone should not have done what they did. Don't think about what you're saying. Don't think about the content of it. Think in the first instance about what you're doing. What do you have to do to use vocabulary in the way that confers on it the significance that normative vocabulary has? And then they had the view, well, it's expressing an attitude. I'll say parenthetically, I think the assimilation goes better if you think of it as expressing a commitment, and just think that besides doxastic commitments, there are practical commitments. What's distinctive about the commitment you express using normative vocabulary is that you're endorsing the propriety of practical reasoning, whose conclusion is the undertaking of a commitment to do something rather than just endorsing a claimable. But although Price wasn't using the terminology of pragmatic metavocabularies, he could see them as offering subject naturalist accounts. That they wanted us to start off talking about what you're doing in using the vocabulary, rather than worrying about the content of it. And so there he saw the possibility of a rapprochement between these two philosophical traditions that had not recognized each other as having any deep commonalities. What made Blackburn a particularly good figure for him to focus on is, first of all, that Blackburn didn't restrict his attention just to moral vocabulary, to ethical vocabulary, or even to normative vocabulary more generally, as, for instance, Gibbard did, or his colleague Peter Railton, whose principal interests lay there as well. Blackburn explicitly also gives an expressivist account of alethic modal vocabulary, talking about the use of terms like necessary and possible. And Blackburn explicitly thought of himself as a Humean or a neo-Humean in doing that, because he thought that what tied together Hume's practical philosophy and his theoretical philosophy was what Blackburn was redescribing as expressivism. So Blackburn diagnoses Hume as seeing a problem in getting from is to ought, but a corresponding problem in getting from is to must be on the theoretical side. And in both cases, saying that the additional element, what you needed to get to what's expressed by normative vocabulary on the one hand and by modal vocabulary on the other, is the habits or attitudes of the speaker, rather than some way the world is being described as being. Now, although Blackburn didn't know Kant well enough to see this, in assimilating Hume's treatment of the practical is ought distinction and the theoretical is must distinction, seeing those as two sides of one argument, just applied in the two cases, really Blackburn is following Kant, who read Hume that way, saw him as puzzled about necessity, which for Kant has these two species, the practical necessity and theoretical necessity. And Kant also thought one response was needed to both of them, structurally parallel at least, even though there were differences between them. So it's Blackburn who assimilated the treatment of modals and morals under the heading of Humean expressivism. And Price's thought is that that attitude can extend, well, first of all, to any problematic vocabulary. So Blackburn mentions the mathematical vocabulary. He doesn't actually elaborate a theory of the use of mathematical vocabulary himself, but does for the morals and the modals. But he was already thinking of semantic minimalism as being an expressivist view about semantic vocabulary, intentional vocabulary, talking about states of belief, desire, intention, and so on. Another perennially problematic vocabulary. And Hugh's view is one should just keep expanding the vocabularies that you make intelligible by specifying, in my terms, in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, what you have to do or be able to do in order to deploy that vocabulary, to use those expressions, expressing the content they do or having the practical significance that they do, that eventually you should just adopt that attitude towards language in general. Next time, I want to talk at least briefly about Hugh's trajectory from the philosophy of physics to this radical view in the philosophy of language, because he thinks that all of our talk about time is something we should, in physics, is something we should be giving an expressivist account of. And he was driven to that by considerations deep inside the philosophy of physics already. So his imperial ambition is to extend this to discourse generally. And Blackburn is open to extending it beyond just certainly the meta-ethical. But Huw sees a structural challenge in synthesizing the traditions that he's concerned to bring together, thinking of me as standing for at least one strand of the Rorty tradition. He doesn't say this, but he's thinking of me as something like synthesizing the Peirce-Lewis-Sellers strand of pragmatism with the Rorty strand in Misak's term. She herself thinks I'm entirely over on the Rorty side. But having told this story about how a proper pragmatist slash expressivist can embrace the idea that there is a unity of a pragmatic unity in what one is doing in talking, corresponding to what I call the iron triangle of discursiveness, assertions inferentially articulated on the side of pragmatics, declarative sentences on the side of syntax, and propositional contents or claimables on the semantic side. Having acknowledged that and thinking it's respectable for a pragmatist slash expressivist to be a declarativist in that sense, to have a uniform story about the use of declarative sentences and so the contents they express. He sees that, I think properly, as being in tension with the pluralism that seems intrinsic to Humean expressivism. That is, they start, even in the meta-ethical paradigm, by saying, look, slow down, you guys, you cognitivists in ethics, don't think that the use of all expressions is on a par. Don't think that there's only one thing you can do with the language, namely say how things are, describe things, represent things. There are all kinds of things you can do with language, even with declarative sentences. For instance, you can appraise, you can blame, you can express your approval or disapproval, or as I put it, your commitment or rejection of commitment. There are all these things you can do. That pluralism about the functions of language is essential to the anti-representationalism, anti-descriptivism of the expressivists. It's localized and pluralistic. But he was invoking my story to underwrite in ideally a way acceptable to pragmatists the treatment of everything that you could express with a declarative sentence as having a uniform function, at least as being intelligible as making assertions that stand in inferential relations to each other and so express propositional contents. So how are those to be reconciled? That's the question that he asks in this Expressivism for Two Voices. And, you know, we can see that there's two different attitudes towards the later Wittgenstein here, because the sort of uniform account of assertion that I'm giving is disagreeing with Wittgenstein and saying, no, there is a downtown to language. And the expressivists are much more on Wittgenstein's side if we look not at his metaphor of the city without a downtown that's just suburbs loosely connected to each other, but to tools. The proper use of that metaphor, as Price is very clear, is not the one Dewey was tempted by and that I've criticized him for being tempted by, thinking of language itself as a tool. That, remember, the difficulty with that is you can't say what it's for in any way that specifies that goal as something that could be done by any other means. But it's intrinsic to the instrumental means and form of intelligibility that you have to be able to specify the goal in a way that at least leaves open the possibility of there being multiple means to that end. So that's an improper use of the language as tool metaphor. But vocabularies as tools that have different functions and that work in very different ways, that's a good idea. And Wittgenstein will say, if you're tempted to think, well, what we do with language is describe how things are or represent how things are, think of tools, you're maybe thinking of hammers and nails and screws and screwdriver and glue and brushes as all ways of doing the same thing, attaching two things together. But what about a measuring tape or a tool belt or the pencil that the builder uses? These have all completely different functions, and so it is with language. That's the proper multiplicity of functions reading of the language as tool metaphor. But how is that to be reconciled with the uniformitarian sort of picture of a downtown of language that consists of assertion? And here, I think we're seeing a manifestation of a difference in philosophical temperament of the sort that leads, for instance, Misak to think that, well, maybe I won't go there, but a difference in temperament that sees that sort of functional pluralism as absolutely essential to the pragmatist insight. That Platonism, in Dewey's view, is seeing universality and principles behind the motley of practice, instead of seeing principles as the hard-won precipitate of that motley of practice. Rorty was fond of Isaiah Berlin's distinguishing between the fox and the hedgehog, the fox who knows many things and the hedgehog who only knows one. I think Archilochus is the originator of that. So Isaiah Berlin uses this to talk about different intellectual temperaments, whether you're comfortable with a plurality that isn't really unifiable in any, a phenomena that really isn't unifiable in any way, or whether you thirst for a unifying principle. That's the hedgehog's view. And the reconciliation that Price is after in this Expressivism in Two Voices is between a unifying principle, let's think about what all the assertions and assertables have in common, versus the diversifying pluralist Fox's impulse. There's an interesting reading of Wittgenstein's pluralism. Hans Julius Schneider had a book, Fantasie und Kalkül, Imagination and Calculus, that was about the contrast between Frege and Wittgenstein. Frege as a paradigmatic hedgehog, and Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, as a paradigmatic fox. But he drills down a little deeper in his reading of Wittgenstein's foxiness, sort of what's behind the idea that it's not just, there's a lot of functions, a lot of different things you could do with language, a lot of different functions it could perform, but it's an in principle unsurveyable motley. It's something that when we understand what talking is, we see in principle resists systematization. What is Wittgenstein's thought there? You know, whether it's a good thought or not, what leads to his confidence there? And Schneider's reading, and this, I certainly felt, I understood Wittgenstein better in the light of what he said, is it's a view about the development of practices, that it's essential to discursive practice that it's protean, that one set of practices is projected into, grows into, develops into another set of practices. And the underlying thought then is that the most you could systematize would be a time slice, a still photograph of the practices. And whatever you had systematized would be falsified by the next development of the practices. I think last time I mentioned the Wittgensteinian anecdote about practices of talking about gold in people's teeth, developing into practices of talking about pain in their teeth. Oh no, my machine just did something bad. Are we still here? My machine blanked out on me.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry. Where the important thing about the new practice was just that it turned out, though it needn't have and maybe wasn't predictable, but everybody who could use the old in talk about gold in the teeth could catch on to the pain in the teeth talk, even though, as we want to say, the rules were different. There were questions that made perfect sense before that don't in the new practice. Another example that Schneider mentions from Wittgenstein, he says, imagine that we only used proper names for people. So, for instance, it always made sense to ask, well, who's the mother and father of this nameable? But then we expand the practice. It turns out we can catch on to naming rivers as well. But now it doesn't make sense to ask who's the mother and father of this river, but it turns out, you know, we can catch on to this. And one of the points I made last time from examples like this is Wittgenstein thinks of the puzzles that come up when you ask questions like, where was the pain before it was in my teeth? And who are the parents of this river, as distinctively metaphysical puzzles. And that always they're the result of our not appreciating that the practice has evolved from a practice in which those questions made perfect sense into a practice in which they don't make sense anymore. And that's a perennial possibility because of the protean nature of our practices that are always changing, so that there's always going to be some feature like that of them. But Schneider's Wittgenstein thinks that this projection of one practice into another, it's turning into a practice in which you can do things you couldn't do before, can apply the term in cases you wouldn't apply it before, that this is of the essence of what talking is, and is why we can be confident that even if we got a good botanization of different things you could do with language now, that it wouldn't survive the next evolution of our practices at a micro level or a more macro level. So I'm saying this tension that Price diagnoses between Humean expressivism and a uniformitarian picture of discursive practice as having at its core practices of giving and asking for reasons, making claims, giving reasons for them and challenging them, and everything else being attached to that and having to be made intelligible in terms of that, that there's a tension between these. And I mean, his reconciliation is pretty much what you would think, but it's a springboard for him to go on. And that is, he thinks of the bland anodyne story about assertion as the undertaking of commitments whose entitlement is always in principle in question, as something like the canvas on which the Humean expressivist is going to paint more colorful pictures of different kinds of practices. Saying, look, really we can think about all of this as taking place within the confines of a general story about what you have to do to use an expression to give it the significance of a declarative sentence, to use it to make assertions. And in this way, he thinks we can see these views as complementary and reconcile them. In the third essay, he goes farther down the road to in conceding to semantic representationalists by saying there is some more substantive notion of representation that goes with that bland anodyne background account of assertion, declarative sentences, and propositional contents. And that's what he calls I representation, internal representations. And here on the handout, late in it, you'll see his definitions of these. So the E representation, the E is for external, but also environment tracking paradigm of representation, dependent on such notions as covariation and indication relations, cites Hartree Field. Think of examples such as the position of a needle in the fuel gauge and the level of fuel in the tank, the barometer reading and the air pressure, and so on. This is what Sellers made fun of under the heading of the thermometer view of non-inferential reports, talking about Price's namesake, H.H. Price, in an earlier generation. In these cases, the crucial idea is that some feature of the representing system either does or is in some sense intended to vary in parallel with some feature of the represented system. In biological cases, for example, this gives priority to the idea that the function of a relation, of a representation relation, is to co-vary with some external environmental condition. And what he wants to reject is the idea that that's a good model for the way our talk in general works. Maybe some of it does, he says, but much less of it than you would think. Remember, he's looking over his shoulder at physics, and the bits of it that he wants to give, that he wants to say are not e-representational in this sense. But he's now willing to entertain a notion of I-representation, a notion that gives priority to the internal functional role of the representation. Something counts as a representation in virtue of its position or role in some cognitive or inferential architecture. Here it's an internal role of some kind, perhaps causal functional, perhaps logico-inferential, perhaps computational, that takes the lead. And he goes on to say, the two notions have their origins in two distinct notions of representation. The former, well now, I-representation, belongs in a particular normative inferentialist version of the systemic functional notion, which characterizes representations in terms of their roles in networks of various kinds. That, of course, is all extremely congenial to me. My project here is to reconstruct the representational dimension of conceptual content in terms that are acceptable to a pragmatist, in terms ultimately of a normative, inferential, pragmatic meta-vocabulary. The latter, e-representation, belongs with notions of representational as environmental covariance. My new bifurcation thesis, he says, claims that these are not two competing accounts of a single species of representation, but two quite different beasts. And that it is this fact, not the old bifurcation thesis, that is the key distinction that expressivists need to make their project run smoothly. Remember, the old bifurcation thesis was that there are two kinds of discourse: properly descriptive discourse or vocabulary, what I talk about as OED vocabulary, ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary on the one hand, and a discourse that we should give an expressivist account of. And his earlier, up until this essay, which I think is 2010, view, was that that was the problem, that there was no good way to draw that distinction. And that was why local expressivists were going to be driven to being global expressivists. And so global anti-representationalists. And now he's happy to see I-representation as ubiquitous within the declarativist realm, and to allow that, in that sense, everything has a representational dimension, and that the important thing is just to insist that many kinds of discourse do not have an e-representational dimension. So he's going to say, for instance, that normative discourse does not have an e-representational dimension. So he has, over the course of, well, the 4 essays, if we think of the one we read for last time, and in the course of 5 to 7 years, I guess he gave the Descartes lectures in 11. They were published in 13. He has, on the one hand, given us a conceptual framework to exhibit a broadened expressivism of Blackburn's type and a developed Rortyian pragmatism that includes the sort of stories about discursive practice that I've elaborated as sister projects, at least, advancing in the same direction, and furthermore, able to complement and support each other. And at the same time, made a series of distinctions culminating in the distinction between I representation and E representation, further articulating the notion of representationalism, or of a semantic representational model, where at the beginning, as he says, when he was an unreconstructed, straight up and down anti-representationalist in the tradition of Dewey, Wittgenstein, and Rorty. Now he still rejects representationalism in the sense of giving a uniform e-representational semantic reading of the contents expressed by arbitrary vocabularies. He's still an anti-representationalist in that sense, but he now sees this as being compatible with being a global representationalist in the sense of I-representations. So this is a more nuanced view on his part that is the positive result in his thinking of this synthetic enterprise that forges a new sort of Cambridge pragmatism by combining Blackburn's, well, a redescribed and extended version of Blackburn's Humean expressivism with Rortyian pragmatism as anti-representationalism. So let me stop there to invite questions or comments.
I have a question. So according to Price, what's the difference between E representation and big R representation, besides that, say, in my understanding, that the big R representation is normative, essentially?
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think it's not just difficult to tell exactly what big R representation is in this essay, but a dangerous question for him to answer, given his commitments. That is, I mean, there's part of what he means by it that I think is safe and easy for him to say, and that is, big R representation is saying what you do with language, what it's for, is describe or represent how things are in an e-representational way. So treating e-representation as your global semantic model, that's big. And that's part of what he means by big R representationalism. Of course, he's using the expression because Rorty does. That's a characteristic Rorty rhetorical device. And Huw is looking over his shoulder at the anti-authoritarian argument. That is, he still wants to sign on to Rorty's late adoption of the Deweyan assimilation of representation and God as objectionable on corresponding Enlightenment grounds. But exactly how that works and what the relationship is between signing on to the anti-big R representationalism and this safer rejection of e-representation as a global model, I don't think it's resolved here. And as I say, it's not obvious anyway how to resolve it, given his collateral commitments. So when I said good question, yeah, I think you put your finger on sort of the sore point that's left here.
Thanks.
Yeah, James.
I wonder how much you take him to have conceded here in this late work, because I'm particularly thinking about his naturalism, because it seemed in earlier essays that some of the contention between him and you surrounded this difference between anthropology and metaphysics. And he seemed to be worried that a semantic view that was normative and inferentialist would commit you to some kind of metaphysical slippery slope or some kind of substantive metaphysical commitments. And it seems to me that the driving force there was the desire to have a naturalist account. But now I see with the I representation, this concession that looks like a concession, which is that we can have a kind of system internal inferential account of representation. So is he still a subject naturalist? And if so, what became of the concern about metaphysics?
Okay, good. He is certainly still a subject naturalist. And we can see the traces of that, him leaving himself the out in saying, here's an internal role of some kind, perhaps causal functional, perhaps logico-inferential, perhaps computational, that takes the lead. So, I take it part of what was implicit in your question is, when you go functional, you're talking norms. There's functional norms functioning properly, or what the proper function of something is. And I think of my view is functionalist, but with two important modifiers. And the one is that I think of the functional system as being social practices, set of practices of a community, rather than sort of between the ears of a human individual. And then I would distinguish between causal functionalism and normative functionalism. So we have, over the last philosophical generation, gotten very good conceptual tools for talking about, for articulating functionalism. I'm thinking of David Lewis saying, take a theory, ramsify it relative to some of its vocabulary, that is, replace a bunch of its predicates or relational relational terms with variables, second order variables, pull them out front, and that's your functional system. And then he wouldn't put it quite, well, he puts it, and now look at what the best realizers of that Ramsey sentence are, specified in your favorite vocabulary. That's the part he wouldn't say, but because he thinks it's obvious it should be a naturalistic vocabulary. But still, we can say whatever your use vocabulary is, whatever you're comfortable with, look at the best realizers specified in that terms. And those are the things that play the roles that are specified by the ramified theory. Well, causal functionalism is going to hold unramified in the theory causal relations among things. Now, there's questions about what those are, but maybe those are just subjunctively robust dependence relations, or maybe you have a different view about causal relation. But that's causal functionalism. Normative functionalism is going to hold unramified as articulating the system, the use of normative vocabulary that says how it's proper for this thing to stand to this other thing. And even if we agreed that the best realizers should be specified in a naturalistic vocabulary, still, if the functional roles essentially depend on the use of normative vocabulary, then you're going to be committed to whatever the use of that normative vocabulary commits you to. Now, Huw here is marking that he doesn't mean to commit himself to the propriety of normative functionalism in this regard. It might be causal functional in that Lewisian sense, or logico-inferential. Well, inferential, that's what I would say, and in my mouth, that's a normative notion. By saying logico-inferential, he's suggesting the alternative he's considering here is, well, the norms are all determined by a set of rules of logic, and there's nothing sort of metaphysically challenging about that. Well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but at least you might think that, say, stipulating your logical norms, or that they were neutral or something. I mean, the norms of logic in the Tractatus are neither naturalistic nor, I don't know, spooky. But at any rate, that's what he's leaving room for there. Or perhaps computational. Well, again, he's thinking that's a naturalistic vocabulary that you could hold fixed, unramified in specifying your functional theory. He's also looking over his shoulder at the teleosemanticists, at Ruth Millikan, at David Papineau, Kim Sterelny, who are going to use ultimately a lethic modal vocabulary in order to underwrite normative, discursive normative vocabulary. So this is all safely naturalistic for him. So he's hoping to be able to make this concession about eye representations, and with it allow what he wouldn't allow before, that besides doing pragmatics, you can do semantics. Right? Semantics is going to be specifying the contents that are conferred on things functionally by them being used in the way that they are used. So from my point of view, he's come a long way towards the way I think about things, looking at pragmatism, methodological pragmatism, as saying you're allowed any semantic contents that you can understand as being conferred on expressions or states by the role they play in what you specify in your pragmatic metavocabulary, the use of the expressions or the functional system that they're taking part in. Now, in a passage that I included in the handout at the end of the first essay, he says, Brandom talks about reconstructing in pragmatist terms the representational dimension of discourse and these other things. But if you look at what he really does, and he takes the normative discourse, he takes norms as an example. He says, Brandom says that there's a difference between what I'm doing and what he's doing because he believes in norms, whereas I'm a strict naturalist. So if I Price allow myself normative vocabulary, it's only if I can reconstruct it in good naturalistic terms where Brandom isn't imposing that. But if you look at what he does, he gives us a pragmatic meta vocabulary for normative vocabulary. That is, what I do is say how you have to use expressions for them to have normative significance, to be expressing normative concepts. Basically, they codify proprieties of practical reasoning. That's the chapter 4, making an explicit story about normative vocabulary. He says, that's fine with me. That's in a pragmatic meta vocabulary and doesn't commit him, if you're not, in addition, a representationalist and descriptivist, doesn't commit him to the existence of norms, which would be the metaphysical commitment that he wants to resist. Well, yes, but my account isn't reductive because I do it in a normative, pragmatic meta vocabulary. So, it's not as unmetaphysical as he wants a proper story to be, and is hoping to sort of bring me over from the dark side to embrace. That there's still that residual metaphysics and systematic Salarzian hedgehog view as well. That is, there's now I will say it's a criterion of adequacy for me to embrace a world that has norms in it. Norms instituted by our social practices, but nonetheless real, and instituted in a way that, in the case of some conceptual norms, lets them swing free of our attitude, so that we could all be wrong about whether, about what we're committed to by using this expression. And I see the big challenge as saying what practices, how practices that were instituted just by our practical attitudes could achieve that kind of transcendence. But the sort of thing that makes naturalists worry about norms, well, if there were such things, how would we know anything about them? I mean, do we causally interact with them? And there I want to say, well, cause is your word, not mine, but we can perceive them non-inferentially in essentially the same sense in which we can perceive red things. That is, part of being properly brought up is to be able to respond non-inferentially to proprieties and improprieties by applying normative concepts to them. And we need an account of what non-inferential reporting is that makes sense of that. And we need that in order to be able to understand how, when you say something, I can hear what you mean, not just the noises you make. And that's because in learning a language, you learn to respond to the contents, which are normatively articulated. Well, is that a broadly naturalistic story? The meta vocabulary is going to be irreducibly normative, but there is a sense in which, let me say, so I think that basically the two straws floating as far as making sense of normativity in the broad sense that's required for discursive normativity. I'm not speaking about moral normativity here, but the norms involved in concept use are teleosemantics, of which I take Millikan's view to be the most sophisticated and developed, and some sort of social practice functionalism. Those are the only ideas anybody's had, as far as I can see. The sort of selectional view that she's got, that is very Peircean, and the, I would say, more Deweyan, Wittgensteinian view that I'm at least groping towards. And from my point of view, both of those are broadly naturalistic. It's a social product in my case, but again, if there isn't anything mysterious about how our practices can institute norms and so confer meaning, then how could you be puzzled about what those things were? That's the subject naturalist insight. And I want to say that at least some version of that is still going to apply. Huw still oscillates between thinking, no, that's unacceptably metaphysical and non-naturalist on the one hand, or thinking, you, Brandom, are misdescribing your own commitments, because what you're doing is really describing in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary what we're doing in a way that he thinks he can co-opt into a naturalistic pragmatic meta-vocabulary. So, I mean, one of the things I hope you can come to appreciate from reading sort of the dialectic here is how much more articulated and fine-grained the topic has become since Rorty. Partly because of the sort of constructive work I've done, and partly because of the line that Huw is making work here, and the way he's co-opted the work that Simon Blackburn has done. And one effect of that is to make it that there's a lot more ground level philosophical work to be done than Rorty thought there was to do in describing how our discursive practices actually work and let us do the things that we do. And some of the stuff we're going to read of Huw's, which is actually some of it's written earlier than the things we're reading here, are his attempt to do that pragmatic labor, his story about assertion, about these other social practices. Okay. Well, you'll see from when I post the notes that there was sort of another turn of the crank I was hoping to get into this session that I'll start off with next time, which just to advertise it, in aid of bringing together Rortyan pragmatism and Blackburn style Humean expressivism, which, as I said, I think was a brilliant idea, and that Huw actually brought it off. It was not easy either to envisage or to manage. But in doing that, particularly in the two voices comparative essay, he talks about my view as expressivist, Brandomian expressivism and Humean expressivism. And 90% of that, I think, is just good persuasive redescription. Okay, let's think of there being this generic thing, expressivism. Eventually, he's going to talk about total expressivism. That's the union of the BEX and the HEX. The excuse for characterizing my making explicit views as expressivist is, well, the story of claiming is that to put something in claimable form is to express it. That is, to make it explicit. To be sayable is to be put into propositional form, that is, into the form of something that can be asserted, that can be given as a reason, and for which reasons can be given. So that's a notion of expression as explicitation. But by the time he's writing this, I was developing already in the Locke lectures an expressivism in a completely different sense of expressivism, in what we could think of as Kantian expressivism as opposed to Humean expressivism. And that's a view that when he wrote these things, he hadn't yet caught up with, sort of chasing each other in real time because our views are developing. And I want to at least get that possibility of a Kantian expressivism, which I learned from reading Sellers. It comes out of my reading of Sellers. Huw only started to read Sellers then. One of the essays we'll look at is his reading of Sellers. What does he get from it? I'm reminded here, so, by the end of the course, you will be up to date in this, burgeoning literature, non-mainstream as it may be, but there is a particular lack of finality when sort of all the views are still evolving. I'm reminded, maybe this is the thought I'll leave you with, that when Pablo Picasso died, of course, the greatest painter of the century, and all the reporters went around to the Picasso experts and said, well, the great man has died, what do you think? And they were quite taken aback that the universal response was, well, he was old, he lived a good life, but really a sigh of relief because now we can get down to work. It was really impossible to do serious work, even seriously just to understand what he was doing and his development while he was alive, because, we're worried about, well, what was he painting at one period? What was he painting at another? How did his style and his aspirations evolve? And that turned crucially on what did he really paint and when, given that there are forgeries and imitations rife. And it was perfectly clear to all of us who studied him that if somebody brought him a painting and said, did you paint this? And if so, when? If Picasso liked it, he claimed to have painted it. And if he didn't like it, he claimed he hadn't painted it. And if he said he had painted it, he would just make up some time period when he said he had. And this made our work completely impossible, Often we could tell that he was wrong, but what are we supposed to do with this? The man himself said, I painted that, or I did not paint that. Now that he's gone, we can get down to serious work in understanding what was going on. And there is an advantage to working on the mighty dead in this regard, that at least, you know, they're going to sit still and not contradict you. Whereas you and I are still sorting these things out. So, okay. The story will continue at any rate. I'll start with the Kantian expressivism next time. And as always, I'll stick around after I turn off the recording.